My name is Mara Ellison. I'm 29 years old. I was working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour diner off Highway 52 the night everything quietly tilted on its axis. It was my fourth job that month, the one I'd picked up to cover my brother's physical therapy bills after his motorcycle accident. By 3 a.m., I'd been awake for 19 hours straight, bouncing between my day job at the community college admissions office and this place with the sticky counters and humming fluorescent lights. My feet ached in the cheap black shoes I'd bought at a discount store. My lower back throbbed from carrying plates and coffee pots, and my eyes burned with the kind of exhaustion that feels like sandpaper. But I needed every dollar, so I kept moving. Around 3 o'clock a.m., he walked in. The kind of man who doesn't belong in a place that smells like burnt coffee and fryer oil. Expensive suit, tailored perfectly, probably worth more than I made in 3 months. A Rolex that caught the fluorescent lights with every casual flick of his wrist. Italian leather shoes that squeaked on the checkered floor like they were offended to be there. He sat at the counter and immediately started snapping his fingers at me like I was a dog. Coffee. Black. Make it fast. No, please. No, thank you. No eye contact. Just entitlement dripping from every word. I swallowed the instant flare of anger and did what I always did. I poured his coffee, slid the mug in front of him, and took his order. Steak and eggs, over easy. Wheat toast, hash browns, extra crispy. Standard late-night power man meal. While I was putting in his order, he pulled out his phone and started making calls, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. He talked about numbers in the millions, like they were loose change, dismissing people's companies and ideas as if they were nothing. These entrepreneurs, he said into his headset, laughing as he cut into his steak later, they come in acting like their little apps are going to change the world. I pretended not to listen, but it was impossible not to catch pieces of the conversation. Every few minutes, he'd snap those fingers again without even glancing at me. More coffee. Then, water with exactly 3 ice cubes. Then, extra napkins. This stack is pathetic. Each command chipped at my patience. Each time, I refilled his mug, brought the water, fetched the napkins, acting like I didn't hear the contempt in his tone, acting like it didn't bother me, acting because I needed the tip. About 20 minutes later, his friend walked in. Another suit. Same watch, same shoes, same energy. The second guy slid onto the neighboring stool like he owned the place too, and they launched into loud shop talk. I caught enough to understand who they were. Venture capitalists. The kind of men who decide which startups live or die based on 10-minute pitch meetings. The kind who hold people's dreams in their manicured hands and pretend it's just another Tuesday. These founders, the first guy scoffed, cutting through his steak like it was someone's hope. They show up in cheap suits, hands shaking, and think their slide deck is going to impress us. Most of them can't even explain their business model, the friend said with his mouth full. Can't answer basic revenue questions. Waste of our time, honestly. They spent the next hour ripping apart people who had probably poured every waking moment and every dollar into those pitches. They mocked their nervous stammering, their ill-fitting clothes, their desperation. I moved around them, refilling coffee, clearing plates, pretending not to exist. When I brought their food, the first guy didn't look up. He just waved a hand dismissively when I asked if they needed anything else, like I was a glitch in the background instead of the person keeping their endless requests straight. His friend finished eating, left a 20 on a $47 bill, and said, "Keep the change," like he was doing me a massive favor. $3 for an hour of their demanding presence. As they were leaving, the first guy turned back like he'd just remembered I was there. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out. I stiffened. I hated that word. "You should smile more. Might get better tips that way." Then he walked out, already dialing another number, probably about to shred some other founder's dream before sunrise. I didn't respond. I just picked up the sad little tip and tucked it into my apron, swallowing the burn in my throat. This was the deal, after all. I traded hours of my life for other people's change and their casual cruelty. By the time my shift ended at 6 o'clock a.m., my body felt like it was made of lead. I clocked out, grabbed my worn backpack from the employee locker, and stepped out into the pale, early morning light. The world looked washed out, like someone had turned the saturation down. I sat in my car in the parking lot, head resting on the steering wheel, fighting the pull of sleep. I couldn't give in, not yet, because the diner wasn't my real destination. I turned the key in the ignition and drove straight to the meeting that could change everything. The reason I'd been working 4 jobs, living on caffeine and adrenaline, and the thin hope that none of this was for nothing. My brother's physical therapy bills were part of it, sure, but there was more. For the past 2 years, I'd been building my own company in the cracks between shifts, piece by piece. A software platform for medical billing that could save small practices thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours. I'd coded it between midnight and 3:00 a.m., tested it with my brother's physical therapist who kept getting screwed by insurance companies, and sold the first handful of customers by sheer persistence. Landing an investment today would mean I could finally quit working myself to death. I could hire a real developer, maybe 2. I could bring on someone to do sales so I wasn't cold calling between wiping down tables. I could breathe, maybe for the first time in years. I pulled into the underground garage of the glass tower where my meeting was scheduled. Bergman was one of the biggest firms in the region. I'd spent 6 months trying to get on their calendar. When I walked into the lobby, it felt like stepping onto another planet. Marble floors, hushed voices, digital screens on the walls, cycling through logos of companies they'd funded. I wondered how many of those founders had once felt like I did, more exhausted than human, more desperate than confident. The receptionist led me to a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. I checked the time, 8:11 a.m. My pitch was scheduled for 8:15 on the dot. I took a deep breath, smoothed my thrift store blazer, and stepped inside. And there he was, sitting at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone, coffee cup in hand. Mr. Coffee Black, and make it fast himself. The man who'd left me a $3 tip 4 hours ago. The man who'd told me to smile. His nameplate read what I already suspected, managing partner. The man who'd treated me like I was invisible at the diner was about to decide the fate of my company. Our eyes met for a second, and nothing flickered in his expression. He didn't recognize me. Of course he didn't. To him, I had been a nameless server in a faded apron. Interchangeable, forgettable. But I remembered him. My hands shook as I set up my laptop at the far end of the table. The screen flickered awake, my slides waiting. I wiped a smear of diner grease I hadn't noticed off my sleeve and forced my breathing to slow. I had 15 minutes to convince a man who thought I was invisible that what I'd built mattered. The door opened again, and his associate walked in. The same friend from the diner who'd left the keep the change tip. He sat beside the managing partner, checked his watch, and let out a faint sigh. "Let's make this quick," the man at the head of the table said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "I've got a flight to catch." I clicked to my first slide, feeling all 21 hours of wakefulness pressing down on me. My exhaustion hit like a physical weight, my eyes gritty, my hands trembling just enough to make the laser pointer wobble. But I'd fought too hard to get into this room to fall apart now. "Thank you for your time," I began, my voice a little rough. "My company is called MedBridge, and we're solving a $23 billion problem in healthcare administration." And as I started my pitch, staring at the man who'd snapped his fingers at me for coffee, one thought repeated like a drumbeat in the back of my mind. He might not remember who I am, but he is going to remember what I build. The room felt unforgiving from the moment I began speaking. The glass walls, the sterile light, the city spreading endlessly behind the 2 men who had mocked strangers hours earlier. It all made me feel impossibly small. But I pushed through the fog of exhaustion, stared at the numbers and graphs on my slides, and willed my voice to stay steady. I'd rehearsed every word of this pitch in my bedroom at 2 a.m, while my brother slept on the couch, ice packs strapped to his leg. I wasn't going to let some entitled suits be the reason all of this collapsed. Small medical practices spend an average of 14 hours a week on billing and insurance claims, I said, sliding into the next part of my pitch. That's more than 700 hours a year per practice. The managing partner, Thorne, I knew now from the nameplate, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, blank expression. The same posture he'd had at the diner, except now he wasn't demanding coffee. He was silently deciding the fate of my startup. His associate, Colin, was already scrolling his phone. No note-taking, not even a pretense of basic engagement. I kept going. "That's $28,000 in labor, not including delayed claims or revenue loss from errors." Click. Next slide. "Our platform eliminates manual data entry through machine learning and OCR extraction, streamlining. We've heard this pitch before, Colin interrupted, not bothering to look up. My pulse jumped, but I forced a nod. There are other platforms, yes, but none with our integration depth or setup speed. Click. Demo video. Most platforms take 3 weeks to onboard. Ours takes 20 minutes. Real case study. A Portland family care doctor saved $43,000 in recovered revenue and $18,000 in labor costs using MedBridge for 6 months. Silence, except the soft, rhythmic tapping of Thorne's finger on the table. What's your traction? He finally asked. I swallowed. 23 paying customers, $82,800 in annual recurring revenue, 34% month-over-month growth. That's nothing, Colin said flatly. My chest tightened. He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't right, not for a bootstrapped founder working 4 jobs. We're limited by bandwidth, I said calmly. Once we scale... No one cares about once, Colin snapped. Thorne lifted one eyebrow, not at me, but at him, as if telling him to shut up, but without actually saying it. What's your background? Thorne asked. Formal CS degree? I'm a self-taught developer, I said. 5 years in healthcare administration before this. I built the platform based on the problems I saw firsthand. So, no formal training, Colin said, his tone coated in judgment. I felt something twist deep in my gut. I'd known this was coming. I'd prepared statistics and customer quotes, but I hadn't prepared for this combination of dismissal and déjà vu. The same casual superiority from the diner, now repurposed with higher stakes. I clicked to the next slide. 98% retention. Net promoter score, 76. Industry average is 31. Thorne leaned forward. Let me stop you. You're bootstrapped, right? No outside investment. Yes. How have you been funding this? Here it was, the question I hated, the one I'd prayed wouldn't surface. I hesitated, just long enough for Thorne to notice. You can tell me, he said. We've heard everything. But he hadn't heard my version. Could I tell him that I spent nights pouring coffee for men like him and days answering calls at an admissions office and afternoons scanning paperwork as a temp administrator and weekends folding clothes at a retail store? Could I admit that every spare dollar had gone to my brother's therapy and every ounce of strength into coding lines at 3 a.m? I forced myself not to break eye contact. Personal savings and revenue from early customers, I said. A technical truth, not a full one. Thorne studied me, but he didn't push. And what happens, he continued, if your algorithm makes an error, a wrong code, a flagged discrepancy missed by staff? Do you have insurance that can handle the liability of an audit? Yes, I said instantly. $2 million E&O policy. And the platform doesn't finalize submissions. It suggests codes. Humans review them. A small nod. Approval? Maybe. But then Colin jumped in again. The market is crowded. Big players dominate. How do you compete? I clicked to my favorite slide. The one that always made me stand taller. We're not competing for hospital systems. We serve small practices, 5 physicians or fewer. They represent a $5.7 billion market that major platforms ignore. For the first time, both men looked at my slide instead of through it. And what are you asking? Thorne said. $500,000 for 15% equity. Colin laughed, actually laughed. You're valuing this at $3.3 million? Yes, I said, based on our growth trajectory, customer satisfaction, and market opportunity. He rolled his eyes, but Thorne didn't. How does your valuation compare to companies at similar stages? He asked. I clicked to a graph. Meaty Match, CareSync, both acquired for tens of millions. Both had revenue slightly above ours at this stage. We're outpacing them in growth and retention. Thorne leaned back again, studying me this time, not my slides. I felt it like a pressure on my skin, the kind that made my breath hitch. Then he said it. You look tired. Something inside me cracked. Of all the observations he could have made, that was the one that broke me open. I am tired, I said. Do you want to know why? Colin shifted in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. Thorne didn't move. I inhaled, then let the truth spill out. Because I worked this graveyard shift at a diner last night, I said. Because after that, I went to my day job. Because I have 2 other part-time jobs. Because my brother needs physical therapy that insurance won't cover, and those sessions cost $180 each. Because I've been building this company for 2 years while sleeping 3 hours a night. The room stilled. I didn't walk into this pitch well-rested and polished, I continued. I walked in from a place where every bill matters, where every hour costs something, where I don't get to fail. For the first time, Thorne's mask slipped. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or guilt. Or curiosity. I'm sorry, I said quickly, pulse racing. That was unprofessional. No, Thorne said quietly. It was honest. He stood abruptly, walked to the window, stared out at the city as if searching for something there. Colin, he said after a moment, give us a minute. His associate shot him a confused look but obeyed. The door clicked shut. I stood there, hands trembling, waiting for the rejection I was sure was coming. Thorne turned back toward me. The diner off Highway 52, he said. You were our server this morning. There it was. The shift, the recognition. Yes, I said, voice steady now. I was. And you came straight here? Yes. He exhaled slowly. I didn't recognize you. A pause. And that's not an excuse. My heart thudded painfully. I was an asshole, he admitted. Yes, I said, you were. A ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Not amusement, but something closer to self-awareness. How much did we tip you? He asked. $3, I said, on a $47 check. Thorne winced. Jesus. And the smile more comment, I added? That was you. He grimaced harder. Yes. Silence stretched between us. Awkward. Heavy. Strange. Your platform, he finally said. It's good. Very good. But your valuation is aggressive and your customer base is small. I braced myself. I'm going to make you an offer, he continued. $300,000 for 20% equity. A gut punch. Lower valuation. More ownership given up. And, he added, I'll release an additional $200,000 if you hit 100 customers and triple your revenue within 6 months. My breath caught. He extended his hand. Think about it. Give me your decision by tomorrow. I didn't take his hand. Not yet. Not after the diner. Not after all of it. But I nodded. I'll let you know, I said. I packed my laptop and walked out of the conference room, past the glass walls, past the polished halls, past the receptionist who smiled politely. Outside, the sun was finally climbing high enough to light the streets. I'd pitched my company to the man who treated me like nothing. He offered me $300,000, and now I had to decide whether I could work with him. I drove straight to the hospital after the pitch, my mind spinning between disbelief, anger, temptation, and exhaustion. My brother was in the rehab gym when I arrived, gripping the parallel bars with trembling arms, while his therapist, Denise, stood behind him, ready to catch him if he faltered. He glanced up when he saw me and tried to smile, but pain flickered through it. 3 more steps today, he grunted, taking another shaky motion forward. That's progress, right? I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. It's amazing. I waited until he was done, until Denise wheeled him over to the bench and handed him a water bottle, before I told him what happened. Not the toned-down version. The real one. The diner. The pitch. The offer. The impossible decision now sitting in my hands like a live wire. He listened quietly, the way he always did. No interruptions, no judgment, just absorbing. When I finished, he wiped sweat from his forehead and said, So, what do you want to do? I sank onto the bench beside him. I don't know. He's an ass. He was disrespectful, insulting, and now he wants 20% at a valuation that's lower than I asked. But, my brother said softly, but $300,000 would change everything. I stared at the tile floor. I could quit 2 of my jobs, maybe all of them. I could hire a real developer, maybe an actual sales rep. I wouldn't have to work myself into the ground. And, he pressed, and I'd have to work with someone who treated me like I was invisible. My brother took a long sip of water. You know what's interesting? What? He admitted he was wrong. I scoffed. So what? That doesn't undo what he did. No, he said. But most people wouldn't have. Especially people with money and power. You called him out, and he didn't deny it. Didn't gaslight you. Didn't hide. He owned it. I hesitated, because I forced him to. Maybe he needed to be forced. He shrugged. Doesn't change the fact that he did it. And the offer seems fair. Better than fair, considering your situation. Fair isn't the point, I muttered. It is when you're broke and building something worth saving, he said gently. And there it was, the truth I hated but couldn't escape. I dropped him off at home, drove to my apartment, and sat at my desk in the dim afternoon light. My bank account balance glared at me from the screen. $247.23. My loan payments were due in a week. My brother's next therapy session was tomorrow. The numbers didn't lie. Without investment, I had maybe 2 months left before MedBridge flatlined. I opened my inbox. A handful of support tickets, a bug report from a frustrated client, a feature suggestion I would normally be excited about if I weren't drowning in exhaustion. Then I thought about the team I could build with $300,000, the runway it would give me, the time, the breathing room. I clicked compose before I could talk myself out of it. I'll accept your offer with two conditions. My fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. Condition 1. A clause giving me the right to buy back your equity at a 1.5x premium if the working relationship becomes untenable within the first 12 months. Condition 2. You agree to work one shift at the diner where we first met. Not as research, not as a photo op, but because if we're going to be partners, you should understand what it takes to build a company from the ground up without money, sleep, or privilege. I hit send. 4 minutes later, his reply arrived. Condition 1 accepted. Condition 2 is unconventional but fair. I'll work a Friday night shift this week. Let's finalize terms tomorrow. My breath left my lungs in a rush. I'd just accepted $300,000 from the man who told me to smile more. The following months were brutal in a completely different way. I hired my first two developers, Priya, a former Google engineer, tired of corporate politics, and Jerome, a brilliant recent grad whose fingers flew over the keyboard like he was playing an instrument. I hired a seasoned sales director named Monica who could charm her way into any clinic in the city. With them on board, everything changed. Our customer numbers shot from 23 to 78 in 3 months. Revenue tripled. Our churn rate dropped to 0. Clinics started recommending us to other clinics without being asked. And Thorne, annoying, sharp-eyed, relentless Thorne, kept his word. He showed up for his diner shift in jeans and a t-shirt, looking oddly human without his polished armor. I arranged the shift with the manager, who found the whole thing deeply entertaining. I didn't watch him work, but the manager later told me he'd been awful at first. Fumbling orders, confusing table numbers, spilling a soda on a trucker, but he kept going. By the end, he'd gotten the rhythm. He'd also left a 40% tip on every table he served. Our board meetings were intense. He questioned everything, pushed back, demanded data, challenged our assumptions. Sometimes I fantasized about throwing a whiteboard marker at his head, but the infuriating part was that he was usually right. He introduced us to potential partners, helped us negotiate better contracts, flagged flaws in our pricing model before they became disasters. He wasn't easy to work with, but he made me sharper. We hit our 6-month milestones early, 127 paying customers, almost $500,000 in annual recurring revenue. Thorne released the additional $200,000 immediately. 1 year after our first meeting, MedBridge passed 280 customers and hit $1 million in ARR. We'd gone from a desperate one-woman operation to a real company with a real team and real momentum. I felt something unfamiliar, pride, the kind not tied to survival but to success. And somewhere in the middle of the chaos, something shifted between me and Thorne. Not romantically, not sentimentally, just a strange, mutual understanding. Respect, but begrudging. Hard-earned. Complicated. 2 years after our first pitch meeting, a major healthcare software company offered us $24 million for an acquisition. My 80% stake would be worth nearly $20 million. Thorne's 20%, well, he'd done pretty well for himself too. At the closing dinner, he raised a glass to me. To terrible tips, he said dryly, and worse first impressions. I raise mine, to giving people a chance, even when they don't deserve it. He laughed, actually laughed. It felt surreal. That acquisition changed everything. I paid off my brother's medical debt, bought an apartment where silence wasn't a luxury, and strangest of all, I had time, real time. Time to sleep, time to think. Time to rebuild my future from something other than panic. Time to help others who were once invisible, like me. And with the money I now had, I could do that on a much bigger scale. The acquisition wired the kind of money into my account that once belonged only to the world of impossible fantasies. And after the chaos settled, after the lawyers, the accountants, the celebratory dinners, and the final signatures, I woke one morning in my new apartment to a silence so deep it almost scared me. For the first time in years, I didn't have to race across town to a shift. I didn't have to answer 6 support tickets before breakfast. I didn't have to worry that one unexpected bill would topple everything I'd built. I sat there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle into my bones. It didn't take long for me to understand what I wanted to do with that newfound calm. I'd spent years fighting for visibility in rooms where people like me weren't supposed to exist. Now I wanted to build doors into those rooms. Real doors, ones you didn't need privilege, pedigree, or perfect timing to walk through. So I started a fund. Small checks at first. $100,000 to $250,000, for founders who weren't the polished, practiced, Stanford dropout with family money type. I sought the ones working night shifts, caring for sick family members, coding in between 12-hour grinds. The ones with fire in their eyes and exhaustion in their voices. The ones with something to prove. My first investment was in a woman named Lila who had built a scheduling platform for home health care workers while working as a night shift nursing assistant. She showed up to my office with her pitch deck on her phone, her scrubs still wrinkled, her hair in a messy bun, half asleep but burning with purpose. I gave her $150,000 for 15% equity after a 30-minute conversation. After she left, I called Thorne. "I just made my first investment," I said. "How did it feel?" he asked. "Terrifying," I admitted. "What if I'm wrong? What if she can't execute? What if—" "She'll be fine," he said. "You know how I know?" "How?" "Because she reminds you of you, and you turned out okay." I rolled my eyes even though he couldn't see it. "Just okay?" "Don't push it." He hung up before I could argue, but I found myself smiling at the deadline anyway. 5 years went by in a blur of board meetings, pitch decks, accelerator programs, and founders who kept surprising me. My portfolio grew to 23 companies. 18 were thriving, 3 had failed hard, and 2 were teetering on the edge of collapse. But the 18 that survived were doing spectacular work, creating jobs, solving real problems, proving that brilliance isn't limited to people with the cleanest resumes or the smoothest paths. And somewhere in those years, my brother healed, not just physically, but emotionally. He found work he loved, helping others recover, and the light returned to his eyes. Eventually, he fell in love. The wedding was small, but beautiful. Strings of warm lights, soft music, the scent of flowers drifting through an evening breeze. I stood beside him as his best man, best sister, and watched him dance with a careful joy that made my throat tighten. During the reception, he clinked a glass to get everyone's attention and gave a speech that had half the guests wiping their eyes. "My sister," he said, looking directly at me, "saved my life. Not just by paying for my therapy or driving me to appointments, but because she never gave up. Not on herself, not on me, not on the company she built while holding the world together with tape and willpower." My chest burned with pride and something heavier, something softer. After the applause faded and people drifted back to the dance floor, I slipped out to the edge of the room, and that's where I saw Thorne. He'd shown up as quietly as a shadow, in a simple suit, watching everything with that same unreadable gaze he always had. When our eyes met, he gave an acknowledging nod. "You clean up nice," I said when he approached. "So do you," he replied. "It's been a while since I've seen you in something other than a hoodie." "That's what happens when you stop working 80-hour weeks." He smirked. "Do you miss it?" I thought about that for a long moment. About coding at 2 a.m., about pitching to clinics and juggling shifts at the diner, about the desperation that fueled me. Sometimes, I admitted, there was something pure about it, just me and the code and the panic. "That's because you're successful now," he said. "Success is always more complicated than failure." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that your wisdom talking or your therapy?" "Both," he deadpanned. We stood in silence for a moment, watching my brother dance with his new wife. His steps were careful, steady, each one a triumph etched into his posture. "You know," I said quietly, "I never thanked you properly." "For what?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "For taking a chance on me when I was running on fumes and falling apart." He shook his head. "You earned that. I just wrote the check." "No," I said, "you took a risk." "So did you," he countered. "On me." I laughed softly. "Fair enough." Another slow song drifted over the speakers, and couples filled the dance floor. Then, to my utter shock, he said, "Want to dance?" I blinked. "Are you serious?" "Why not? We've survived worse than one awkward dance." He wasn't wrong. So we danced, if you could call it that. Thorne was a terrible dancer. I wasn't much better. We stepped on each other's feet more than once, laughed through all of it, and somehow it felt easy. Natural in a way our board meetings never were. "You know what's funny?" I said as the song ended. "What?" "If you'd been nice to me at the diner, I probably would have been more polished at our pitch. Maybe too polished. Maybe so polished you wouldn't have believed me." He gave me a thoughtful look. "So my being an asshole was helpful?" I grinned. "Accidentally." He rolled his eyes. "You're insufferable." "You're welcome." He left shortly after, offering a rare, sincere congratulations before disappearing into the night. I stayed behind, helping clean up tables, collecting discarded champagne glasses, folding tablecloths with my brother and his new wife. It felt ordinary, beautifully, wonderfully ordinary. And on the drive home, I passed the diner. The same neon sign flickering, the same parking lot, the same smell of coffee and grease lingering in the air. I remembered the woman who once stood behind that counter, exhausted, invisible, underestimated. The woman who served a man who didn't see her, then pitched to the same man hours later. The woman who worked until she nearly broke. She would have been proud of the person I'd become. She would have been shocked too, but proud. And that's the thing about being dismissed by someone who doesn't know who you are. It gives you fuel. It gives you something to prove. And if you're stubborn enough, you turn that fuel into something extraordinary. You turn someone else's blindness into your purpose. You turn disrespect into a doorway. And every time I write a check to a founder who reminds me of that exhausted woman in the conference room, I remember that night at the diner, and this time I smile.